So after seeing how much you enjoyed the last one, I once again sent out a message to different content creators, stating that I have to read whatever they recommend me no matter what, the only rules being that it can't be something I've already read or that someone else has recommended. And I will be reviewing said recommendations and then ranking them from worst to best at the end of the video. I also did a community post, and the top comment under that post got their recommendation included. So if we ever do a part 3, then I'll take whatever the top recommendation for this comment section is. The order in which I review them will simply be the order I read them in, and I heard y'all loud and clear, so I'll have the names of the series pop up on the screen for your convenience. This is part 2 of End My Existence. I think out of all the recommendations I've ever given, this one is by far the most important. Manta Sleep. They create the world's best sleeping mask to help you get the rest that you deserve. I know today's culture is all about working and the grind, but just as important to that in getting your tasks done, being able to rest so you're able to enjoy those tasks and do it at 100% is equally as important. And so my recommendation is to join the pro-nap movement instead of being sleep deprived, having a bad sleep schedule, or being hooked on caffeine. Trust me, I have been all 3 of those at once. I am not a fun person to be around. And Manta Sleep has different masks that help with whatever you're really needing, whether it's a cool mask for your sinuses, a steam mask for stress and dry eyes, or just a standard silk mask, their normal mask, or the Mask Pro, which is what they sent me, that helps just block everything out so you can get the sleep you need. They even have a sound mask to help block out any unwanted noise such as snoring, so if that's a big thing for you, then definitely check this one out. So my personal recommendation to you is to improve your quality of sleep, and you can do so by checking out the link in the description below and use code MASKEDMAN for 10% off your order. And massive thanks again to Manta Sleep for sending me their mask and sponsoring today's video. The first recommendation is from an old pal, NuxTaku. He held me back when my channel was first starting to really grow and has been a really dope person to me in general. His first recommendation was Made in Abyss. However, I had to inform him that I had read that a long time ago, Bondrewd's the GOAT. So his next recommendation was Interspecies Reviewers. He also said, since I sounded ungrateful at that recommendation, I had to read 5 pages of beat. The man lives up to his reputation. The day there isn't something erotic tied to the name NuxTaku, just no space invaders took over his body. Ongoing and currently at 63 chapters at the time I read this, it's about a group of friends and an angel that is losing his halo, going across the lands, far and wide, and taking on the immense task of sleeping with every species and then reviewing them out of 10. I'm not sure whether to be upset that I had to read all of this, or more upset that it isn't a real job. Well, technically it is. I'm pretty sure this is just porn. Surely it is, at the bare minimum. I can't believe it's not porn then. Actually, you know what? Let me check something. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's on Anime. No pun intended, but there isn't really much to review here. It's a quick and easy read, thankfully, with some questionable stuff in all honesty, and a premise that sounds like a Discord conversation brought to life, but hopefully it's all uphill from here, and we got the worst out of the way. The next recommendation is from Bon, an up-and-coming channel that makes some awesome stuff. His video on reading every series from the year 2000 is impressive. A tad masochist on his end, but impressive. Sunny was his recommendation, completed, and at 37 chapters, this shows the lives of children at this orphanage and what they do to deal with their current situation. This isn't for everyone, since I can see many being bored with this manga, but it really had some heartbreaking stuff, or being recovered by their parents. I think it really makes you contemplate and feel the abandonment of some of the characters, and watching them go through different stages of grief at times, or often turn to their imagination to escape, keeps you thinking for a good bit. Of course, minding the phrase never judge a book by its cover, there are certain series you can kind of tell what you're getting into just by looking at it, and this was not one of those manga, and I was pleasantly surprised to find a series full of amazing characters, and so many emotionally powerful and impactful moments in a really small period of time. Although it is a bit of a dense read given all the dialogue, I still think it is an excellent short manga that is worth checking out. From slice of life to sci-fi, the next recommendation is the iconic Battle Angel Alita recommended to me by RealLifeRyan. One of my oldest pals and someone who side by side with me really brought in a lot of Berserk content a few years back. He covers pretty much anything and everything, so make sure to check his stuff out. Battle Angel Alita is completed at 51 chapters. Well, okay, sort of. I checked this manga out a while ago, but I never really read it all the way through, so it doesn't count. For the sake of time, I read Battle